The year was 1876. The Atlantic's waves stretched endlessly to the horizon, restless and dark under an overcast sky. James Carrow, keeper of Halloway Lighthouse, sat at his desk, pen poised over the weather log. His hands trembled slightly from hunger. The meager rations left in the pantry would last another week at best, though his supply ship was already 2 weeks overdue. The isolation gnawed at him like the ceaseless wind battering the stone walls. Months spent alone on the rock had left James talking to himself, the echo of his voice often his only company. Yet he took some small comfort in the rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse's great Fresnel lens, a tireless sentinel against the treacherous reefs. That night, as he took his usual post at the observation window, he scanned the horizon with his brass telescope. The vastness of the sea brought him a peculiar solace. It was lonely, yes, but it was also predictable, until he saw it. On the jagged rocks of the eastern shore, a figure stood motionless. James froze, squinting through the glass. It was unmistakably human-shaped, though featureless in the pale light of the waning moon. It stood too still, like a shadow frozen in place. His first instinct was practical, perhaps a stranded sailor, but the figure made no attempt to signal for help. It simply faced the lighthouse, unmoving. "Hello?" James called out into the night, though the figure was far out of earshot. There was no response. When he looked again, the figure was gone, swallowed by the mist. James tried to dismiss the sighting as a trick of the light. After all, loneliness and exhaustion could conjure strange visions. Yet the next night, at precisely midnight, he saw it again. This time, he studied the telescope, holding it firmly against the sill. The figure stood on the same rock, but closer than before. He could see more now. Its shoulders were hunched, its head tilted ever so slightly toward him. The longer he stared, the more he became certain it was watching him. A deep unease settled over James. He shouted again, though his voice sounded feeble against the roar of the sea. The figure didn't move. It didn't even flinch. When the clock struck 1, the figure turned and walked away, its movements unnaturally fluid, like a shadow slipping through water. James felt the air grow colder as it disappeared into the night. He hardly slept that night, his mind plagued with questions. Who or what was it? And why did it feel as though it were waiting for something? By the third night, the figure was closer still, perched on the rocks at the base of the island's cliff. James no longer attempted to rationalize its presence. Something was deeply wrong, and yet, against all reason, he felt drawn to it. He abandoned his duties, leaving the great light above to falter. Instead, he spent his nights glued to the telescope, watching, waiting. Midnight came, and so did the figure. The year was 1876. The Atlantic's waves stretched endlessly to the horizon, restless and dark under an overcast sky. James Carrow, keeper of Halloway Lighthouse, sat at his desk, pen poised over the weather log. His hands trembled slightly from hunger. The meager rations left in the pantry would last another week at best, though his supply ship was already 2 weeks overdue. It stood with its back impossibly straight, facing the lighthouse as though in silent judgment. James tried to sketch it, his hands shaking as he drew the tall, thin silhouette. But no matter how many times he tried, he could never get the proportions right. The arms were too long, the head too narrow. It was wrong, impossible. His log entries became erratic. Each day, he wrote of the figure, noting the exact time it appeared and the distance it seemed to have covered. It was getting closer each night. By the 5th night, it stood on the beach at the edge of the island, no more than 50 yards from the lighthouse. James felt its presence like a weight pressing against his chest. He no longer shouted. Somehow he knew it wouldn't respond. On the 7th night, James sat by the door at the base of the lighthouse, lantern in hand. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, too consumed by dread and fascination. Midnight came, and with it, the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path outside. He tightened his grip on the lantern, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" He called. No answer. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then came a sound that made his blood run cold. 3 slow knocks. James stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps. The lantern flame flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows on the stone walls. "Go away," he shouted. The door creaked open. The figure stood in the doorway, taller than he'd imagined, its head nearly brushing the frame. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its body was thin, almost skeletal, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far. It didn't move. James screamed, slamming the door shut and bolting it. He ran up the spiral staircase, the lantern swinging wildly in his hand. The air grew colder as he ascended, his breath forming clouds in the dim light. When he reached the lantern room, he locked the heavy iron door and leaned against it, gasping for air. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the sound of footsteps on the stairs below, slow and deliberate. The room felt smaller than usual, the glass walls pressing in on him. The great lens, once a source of pride, now loomed like a giant, unblinking eye. The footsteps grew louder, closer. "Stay back," James shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. The iron door creaked, its hinges groaning as it opened. The figure stepped inside, its face no longer hidden. James froze. He was staring at himself. The figure's face was his own, but wrong, gaunt and pale, its eyes sunken and devoid of life. Its lips curled into a twisted smile, revealing teeth too sharp and too many. "You let the light die," it whispered in a voice that was unmistakably his own. James stumbled backward, pressing against the great lens. Cracks spiderwebbed through the glass, distorting the view of the sea beyond. The waves were rising, impossibly high, black and churning as if they sought to swallow the world. The figure stepped closer, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. James felt the cold radiating from it, seeping into his bones. "No," he whispered. "No, this isn't real." The figure's smile widened. "You called me," it said. The lantern flame guttered and went out. Months later, a passing supply ship noticed the lighthouse's beam had gone dark. A rescue party was sent, though the men were reluctant to land on the island. The locals had long whispered of strange occurrences there, of a curse that plagued those who stayed too long. They found the lighthouse abandoned. The great lens was shattered, its pieces scattered across the floor like frozen tears. James's log ended abruptly, his last entry a single line scrawled in shaking handwriting. "It is here." Of James Carrow, there was no sign. The only clue to his fate was the door to the lantern room, wide open, and the faint impression of footprints leading toward the cliffs. Fishermen who passed by the island in the years that followed spoke of a figure standing on the rocks at midnight. It was always there, motionless, staring at the lighthouse. None who looked too long ever returned.